Hello, everybody. We're just going to let everybody in the door, so to speak. I see people coming into the room now, and we'll get started in a minute or so, or even less. So we'll just see how it goes. I see we're actually doing quite well in terms of people coming in and grabbing a seat, so to speak. So I think what we'll do, Peter, is we'll get started. And first of all, everybody, I'd like to say hello and welcome. My name is Chris Kilford. I'm the president of the Canadian International Council Victoria branch here on Vancouver Island. And I'd like to welcome our CIC members, our guests in Canada and elsewhere, our guest speaker, Peter Jennings, who's here, as we all gratefully meet once more on the traditional lands of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. And for those of you that are not familiar with the Canadian International Council, we're an independent, nonpartisan, membership-driven think tank. And what makes us a little bit different from many of the think tanks in Canada is that we have, I was about to say 18 branches across the country. I can now say 19 branches because we have a new branch that's just opened up in Whitehorse in Yukon. So that's good news. And we have about 1,300 members across the country who are all very interested in Canadian foreign policy. And you can find out more about us by Googling the Canadian International Council. You'll find our CIC Victoria page with contact information. And if you're not a member of our branch or not a member of the CIC, please consider joining us. We have just over 420 members in our branch on Vancouver Island, including 100 students. So it's a pretty lively place to come out and join. And as we go through the program today, I'm sure you'll have questions for Peter, and there is a Q&A feature. I know you're all familiar with it. At the bottom of the screen, you can type your questions there, and I'll take a look, and I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. So let's move on to the event itself. And I'm sure you know, since the early 2000s, China has come to play an even larger role in the economic fortunes of Australia. Today, China is Australia's largest trading partner, but more recently, we know that relations have hit a low point with Australia not allowing the Huawei to be a part of the 5G network there. Australia wanting to know more about the origins of COVID-19 and the cancellation of some Belt and Road initiatives, and I'm sure Peter will go into more of that. But it's led to some difficulties in the Australia-China relationship, and I think the big question now that Peter will talk about is how can that relationship be reset, if at all, in the near future. And so we're really glad to have Peter here because he has so much experience. He is the executive director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. He's been in that position since 2012. And he's also worked at senior levels in the Australian Public Service on defense and national security issues. And his career highlights include being a Deputy Secretary for Strategy in the Defense Department from 2009 to 2012, Chief of Staff to the Minister of Defense from 1996 to 1998, and a senior advisor for strategic policy to the Prime Minister back in 2002 and 2003. No doubt, there's been a lot going on in Australia and that part of the world. Numerous little things that we're seeing, the AUKUS agreement between the UK and Australia and the United States, and even some trouble on the Solomon Islands, which I'm sure we'll get into. And Peter's recently written an article on many of these issues. It's called Too Soon to be Waving the White Flag on China. So Peter, welcome to CIC Victoria. We're glad to have you here, and I'd like to hand the floor over to you to make some opening comments on the Australia-China relationship.
Well, Chris, thank you very much, and good evening to everyone in beautiful Victoria. It's great to be joining you. Chris, if you'll indulge me, I'd just like to make a brief shout out to Jim Bertilia, who has been a long-term friend, who asked me to speak to you today and unfortunately can't join us because he's in Rome. I understand he's become special advisor to His Holiness the Pope, Chris, which is something that probably neither you nor I would have expected, but there you go. He said he'd be watching this later on, so I just thought I'd mention that for his benefit. But let's seriously now move to Australia and China, and I'll make just a few opening remarks to set the scene. I mean, I've been watching this bilateral relationship all my career, sort of now well over 30 years, I'm afraid to say. And frankly, the bilateral relationship between Australia and China is as bad as I have ever seen it, and I think as bad as it has ever been during the course of Australia's now 50 odd years of recognition. We've seen and are continuing to experience rolling trade bans across a wide variety of Australian exports to China, everything from lobsters to wine to coal, barley, and other discretionary items. Besides that, in the billions of dollars worth of value. We've also seen very significant and continuing political and media attacks from the Beijing's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and a variety of newspapers under the control, as they all are, of the Communist Party in China. All of a type which is now categorized as being wolf warrior diplomacy, this example of much more aggressive and assertive and frankly rude PRC behavior towards countries with which they have disagreements. And also we've been in a situation where there has not been any political ministerial level contact between Australia and China now for probably 2 years or so, with no prospect, likely it seems that lack of engagement is going to change anytime soon. So what's been the cause of this? Well, I can point to a series of Australian government decisions which have certainly impacted on the China relationship, and sort of in rough order of time scale, they would include a decision which our government took in August of 2018, which had the effect of excluding Chinese companies from the unrolling of our 5G telecommunications network, which was something that China was watching very closely. I think not so much because they were concerned about the size of the Australian market, we're a population of 26 million now, but more about the demonstration effect that this might have in other countries unrolling their 5G networks. And that has indeed played out. Yes, we're waiting for a decision any day now from Ottawa, but New Zealand, Japan, India, finally the UK, having tried every other possibility first, has now concluded that Chinese component suppliers are to be kept out of their critical 5G networks. So then kind of simultaneously to that decision, our government went through the process of modernizing our anti-espionage and counter-interference laws, which was a body of law that really had not been reviewed, I would say, since the 1950s or 1960s. And although the government didn't say so at the time, this was very much driven by a concern of a heightened state of aggressive intelligence gathering happening in Australia, primarily from China. China is by no means the only active hostile intelligence gatherer in Australia, but it is certainly the largest one and the one that was giving government most concern. So we modernised our political laws. Governments also reformed a very lax political donation system, which was making it possible for foreign entities to actually make donations to Australian parliamentarians at both the state and federal level. When it became apparent in around the 2015-2016 period that there was a huge amount of PRC money sloshing around the major Australian political parties. And this largely came to a head in 2016, where an Australian senator was forced to resign after it was exposed that he had been on the verge of taking something like a $400,000 payment from a Chinese businessman in order to publicly come out and make comments supportive of China's building of military facilities in the South China Sea. And I think that led to a degree of introspection on the part of our major political parties to understand where their financial base was, financial relations was coming from. In addition to that, it's a pretty long list, Chris, really, of the things that were going on. We saw a number of government decisions taken to prevent Chinese investment into critical infrastructure, in particular around the electricity grid along the east coast of the country and the gas distribution network along the west coast of the country, both of which were up potentially for sale to Chinese state-owned entities or to large Hong Kong-based firms. We had a couple of occasions where our government called out China on cyber spying, one which involved our parliament, major political parties and government departments, where effectively and unusually for Australia, the decision was taken to identify China as being the culprit of a major sustained cyber hacking effort, which of course was denied by Beijing, but nevertheless was something that the government saw fit to announce. And then all of this was kind of brought to a head around 2020 when our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, publicly made a call for an investigation into the origins of coronavirus, which was something that the Chinese government took particular exception to. I still find somewhat surprisingly, given it seems to me that it was a perfectly reasonable thought that the world had a right to understand the origins of the virus in order to help manage it and in order to help prevent further outbreaks of future viruses. But nevertheless, it led to a very, very substantial negative reaction from China and most of the trade bans which I mentioned. So to sum all of this up, what I would say is that really between 2015 and 2020, Australia woke up to the reality that our system was being thoroughly suborned in terms of politicians, state governments, universities, elites, large parts of the business community with interests in exporting commodities to China. We simply found that many of these areas were either being quite deliberately compromised in a kind of old-fashioned hostile intelligence way, or were simply becoming compromised because of the depth of their economic connections to China and the dependency that was being created. And over that period of time, that half-decade, governments, at times reluctantly, at times really preferring to look the other way, but when push came to shove, what our governments, successive governments, did was to take steps to try to prevent that type of undermining from happening. Where to from here? Look, what I would say is we're fundamentally in a battle of strategic aims and objectives. China wants to be the regional hegemon, and it wants the countries of the Indo-Pacific, and indeed perhaps more broadly, to essentially be differential and subordinate their national interests to the national interests of the PRC. Australia can't and won't accept that. And so I think we will find a continuation of what has been a very unhappy relationship because it's something which is strategic and structural. It's not a product of our failure to say the right things or to use the right language when it comes to dealing with China. I don't think this is an issue that can be solved unless one or other country changes course. And fundamentally, I don't think that's going to happen. I think China is kind of locked and loaded on this approach, at least for as long as Xi Jinping is General Secretary of the party and President of the country. Mm-hmm. Just briefly to conclude, Chris, what's Australia attempting to do in the face of all of this? Well, really four things. The first is to harden our systems, to harden the capacity of political parties to operate without foreign money, to protect our critical infrastructure, to strengthen our capacities to prevent cyber intrusions. Secondly, we're trying to diversify our economy. Australia is unusual. We're a developed country with largely an economy structured around producing commodities. But the good thing about that is that in most cases, not all, but in most cases, it is possible for us to develop new markets. And that's largely what's happened under the experience of Chinese economic punishment. So, for example, the barley market, which was almost 90% dependent on exporting to China, has now diversified into the Middle East, including Turkey, by the way, Chris, where there's now a market for Australian high-quality barley. We've worked to strengthen the US alliance, and I can talk about the details of that in the Q&A if you like. And we've also sought to really multilateralize what started out as a bilateral problem. And what I'm talking about there is the creation of AUKUS, the lift to prime ministerial level of the Quad, which involves us, the US, India, and Japan, and attempts to do more effectively with our neighbours in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. So that is the elements of an Australian response. But look, let me stop there and hand back to you and to questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you for your opening remarks. And I have some questions for you, and I know the audience does, and I'll be taking a look at those in a moment or two. I wish in many ways Jim Boutillier was here, because I'm sure he would have loved to have asked lots of questions. And I'm mindful also of our very own Jonathan Manthorpe, who calls Victoria home and who's a CIC member and recently wrote a book called Claws of the Panda, where he also looked into China's activities in Canada as well. And it came to my mind as you were speaking about some of the issues that Australia's been facing. One of the things
it's a good book. I have it actually.
Oh, good.
It's on my shelves there somewhere. So
good.
I'm pleased he's on the call.
One of the things I did want to ask you about the trade relationship, because I think it was in 2015 that Australia and China signed that free trade agreement, and then everything seemed to go sideways afterwards. But I just wanted to ask you about the free trade agreement itself. I mean, was there any sort of awareness? It must have been some sort of awareness that having this free trade agreement would have created these dependencies. Where was it all coming from? This desire to have the free trade agreement in 2015, and now having to essentially walk away from much of it.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Chris. And one of the things it points to was a very quick change of Australian attitude about the nature of the relationship that we had with China. Back in 2013, we had a change of government. We had a centre-right government elected under the leadership of Prime Minister Tony Abbott. And Abbott, on election night, declared that Australia was, quote, open for business, unquote. And what emerged from that orientation over the next couple of years was really a rapid deepening of all forms of connections with China in ways which certainly people inside the national security community were concerned about at the time. I certainly was. I felt that this was building on an already over-dependent relationship. But one of the things that Abbott wanted to do was to see the signing of a free trade agreement, which had been already at that stage a decade in negotiation, brought to a quick and swift conclusion. And so it was rather strange that when the free trade agreement was actually signed in 2015, what you had by way of text was material that had largely been assembled a decade earlier in a very different time as far as China's policies were concerned. And there was, believe it or not, but this I can tell you is the absolute truth, there was no national security assessment in 2015 about whether or not this was a smart thing to do. No intelligence assessment, no defence or foreign affairs assessment. And, it It did a range of quite remarkable things, which, for example, opened up large parts of the Australian economy to Chinese investment without review. Basically, any form of Chinese foreign acquisition could happen under about $1 billion worth of value before a review on national security grounds would be triggered. If you looked at the corresponding chapter in the free trade agreement for what this meant for Australian investment into China, it was a blank page and a promise for an effort, a review in 3 years' time, that is to say by 2018, to determine what an investment regime would look like for Australian companies wanting to operate in China. That hasn't eventuated, and I think looking back, it's very clear, very much more clear now that that free trade agreement was not a good thing. It was a bad idea. Had there been no change in the broader direction of the bilateral relationship, it would have cemented a degree of dependence, which I think would have been impossible to reverse. In 2015 also, I apologise if this is digging too much into the weeds, but a proposal to establish an extradition agreement came before the Australian Parliament, which would have made it possible for China to request people to be extradited back to China for legal actions, shall we say, or for criminal proceedings, which was something that the then government of the day and the foreign policy establishment was advocating. And that was only killed effectively by a revolt of the government's backbench, saying that this was going to be a step too far, that we would be very reluctant to release people into a Chinese legal system, which contains execution, the capacity to execute people, and which is in any event essentially beholden to the wishes of the Communist Party. And so 2015 is a pivotal year, and there's going to be a great book written about this at some stage, because it was the high point of the relationship, but it also started the change towards where we're at now. And of course, the critical difference was the arrival of Xi Jinping and the move away from peaceful rise, the sort of Deng Xiaoping philosophy for how China should hide its capabilities and bide its time in world affairs, and the arrival of a more aggressive China. And that was the turning point really in Australia's thinking.
Yeah, your latter point on the extradition I think it's actually very important, because I know a number of the islands nearby have come under a lot of pressure from China. They've received money and they're having to face this whole extradition issue because of it. And they don't have the weight of Australia, so to speak, and feeling the pressure. One of the things Canadians always, I think, like to do is compare themselves to Australia. I think sometimes wondering who's America's closest partner. And we've watched the AUKUS agreement come about recently. And I will say, from a Canadian perspective, if we're comparing ourselves to Australia, you can go back to our 1987 white paper, where you'll find the government of the time saying that Canada would acquire a fleet of 8 to 10 nuclear-powered submarines. And we never did. We never did. And now we see, for example, Australia planning on at least 8 nuclear power submarines. I think it shook things up a fair bit. And I'm wondering, this is all about China's military rise in the region, and Australia is spending a lot of money on defense. Is this sustainable? Do you see Australia having these nuclear powered submarines in the future, or is it something that might just not happen like it did in the case of Canada? I mean, how much money does Australia have in its hands to invest in defense? Because you do spend an awful lot.
Yeah, well, at the moment we spend a shade over 2% of gross national product on defence, which at the moment these are Australian dollars. Our defence budget is about $46 billion a year. Our government is now, I think, it stopped high-fiving itself a long time ago about reaching 2%. I think it now understands that in the strategic environment that we're in, defence spending that lifts over a decade to something like 3 or 4% of gross national product. That would be a doubling of the defence budget if that happened. That's not unrealistic in the in the environment that we're looking at. And clearly, if we're going to move to nuclear propulsion, on the basis of a sort of a back of the envelope view, I think that takes us to 3% of gross national product being spent on defence. No trouble at all. Are we going to be able to do it? That's a tough question, because there's a huge amount of investment which has to be made in everything from nuclear safety through to training a whole new cadre of naval crew. That is going to take years and cost a lot of money. I'd observe, Chris, that the crew for that first Australian nuclear propelled boat is probably not born yet. Maybe the CO and a couple of his XO and so forth, but the majority of the crew won't yet be born. And that tells you just how long that is into the future. The other point is that it's also relevant to say that it doesn't really have that much of an impact on the strategic circumstances that we're currently facing, because I think the question of will China dominate the Indo-Pacific is really a question that's going to be resolved in the next 5 years or so. And for Australia, what that means is that it's going to happen largely with the defence force structure that we have now, with a few tinkering around the edges, perhaps. Chris, I did want to deploy a thought to you, and possibly at the potential annoyance of some in the audience, but I think it's worth putting out just to get a reaction to it, which is to say, I think you could look at the arrival of AUKUS, which is the arrangement that teams the UK, Australia and the US in this partnership around nuclear propulsion, but also a large list of other forms of technology as well, as really a product or as really an outcome that is going to create two tiers in the Five Eyes relationship. So we talk about the Five Eyes partnership, which involves those three countries, but also New Zealand and Canada. And so my line on this is Five Eyes, but two tiers. And it does seem to me that New Zealand, very obviously, but also Canada, is now dropping behind in that picture of military capability. So, for example, Canada has, I think, kind of messed up its position on air combat capability. You're about to now take from Australia classic Hornets, FA-18 Bs and Cs, which we are selling to you in order to provide the Canadian Air Force with a kind of interim capability. But you might be able to fly it in a no-fly zone around Syria, but I would not be taking them anywhere near a NORAD type of commitment. Canada does not have a solution for its future submarine requirements. You're in as bad a place as we are when it comes, I think, to your future frigate and anti-submarine warfare requirements. You're spending considerably less than Australia in terms of defence commitment. Yes, you have a different strategic geography, but I think Canada risks falling behind where its allies and friends would like it to be in terms of its military capabilities. But hey, you don't need an Australian to give you a critique of your own defence capabilities, so maybe I should be smart and stop at this point.
Well, having spent 36 years in the Canadian military myself, I really can't argue with you. We always seem to be the last one in the room. And I sense that now on this particular file, and we've only just seen some, one might say, positive movement. Where it will all lead at the end of the day, I don't know. But in the throne speech, our Governor General actually mentioned the words Indo-Pacific. And now if you go on the Global Affairs website, as I did this morning, it still says the Asia Pacific. But there was quite a buzz in our country, but also in India, in the Indian newspapers were all a buzz in the last few days because of the mention of Indo-Pacific. And we've recently had the Halifax Security Forum, and our new defense minister was there. And I have a little quote where she says, in the Indo-Pacific, Canadian military ships, aircraft, and sailors maintain a solid presence. And she talked about the Indo-Pacific region. So I think we may be slowly coming around, and we'll participate more in some fashion. But I certainly can't argue with you. That's for sure. I do have a question from the audience, Roger Blake, and he mentioned that today the United States announced that they would increase their military presence in Guam and the North Mariana Islands, and he's asking, how do you see that impacting Australia? I might just add to what Roger had to say. We've been watching what's happening in the Solomon Islands, and much of it appears to be over a decision in 2019 to recognize Beijing over Taipei. So we're seeing troop movements in that area. We've got a little bit of unrest going on. This must keep the Prime Minister and Defense Minister up at night.
Well, on the US strategy, first of all, I think what we're seeing here is something that really is being forced by the growth of Chinese military capability, with a design to essentially keep American power as far away from the Chinese mainland as possible. Excuse me, just having a cough there. And so, what we have in North Asia right now is a series of large, highly concentrated American bases in Japan, South Korea, and Guam, which very clearly are going to be early targets of Chinese aggression. If, for example, a war over Taiwan or a war in the South China Sea or the East China Sea got out of control. And American strategy in response to that is going to be to disperse its forces as quickly and comprehensively as it can to help them survive, but also to complicate Chinese targeting. And the moves that are happening in Guam and the Micronesian Islands is really a demonstration of that strategy at work. Northern Australia is going to play into it very significantly as well. And really, I think this is a time when the strategic geography of Northern Australia is perhaps more important than it has been since the Second World War. And across the top end of Australia, we have a series of so-called bare air bases, which can be used as expansion capability if US forces wanted to relocate there, or indeed if Australian forces wanted to deploy from major southern bases. So we're going to see a lot more development in terms of Northern Australia, I think, involving both the US and Australia as well. With regards to the Solomon Islands, it's firstly just worth remembering the strategic importance of the islands, which was demonstrated again in the Second World War. There was a lot of sustained and very bloody fighting on Guadalcanal, which is one of the islands of the Solomon Islands, as the United States and Australia fought a very hard campaign to retake those Melanesian islands to the east and north of Australia from the Imperial Japanese Army. I think actually, if you want to understand a lot of sort of big S Chinese strategy, you can actually find out quite a lot by reading about the strategy of the Japanese Imperial Army in the late 1930s and 1940s, because the geography hasn't changed. China wants to be able to control that island area as a way of firstly enabling its own maritime forces to get into the deep waters of the Pacific. Secondly, as a way of complicating the challenge of the United States to get its forces up to the western littoral of Asia. For Australia, that means to say having the Solomon Islands flirting with the idea of a close relationship with China. There's been discussions, Chris, about a possible Chinese naval base or military base being established on the Solomons. That presents major headaches for Australia. because it means to say that our security would primarily not be something we would be thinking about in terms of our north. But since, for the first time since the Battle of the Coral Sea in 1944, we would also be thinking about our security to the east. So that's the sort of bigger strategic picture for what's going on in the Solomons. And then that the extent of Chinese influence into their political system also plays in complicated and confusing ways with tribal politics, and with the politics of individual islands that are part of the Solomons Federation, but islands have their own government systems. And the rivalries inside the Solomons are immensely strong and complicated too, and now probably being shaped by too much Chinese money in ways which are supporting political elites. So it's a messy picture, and when violence erupts in the Solomon Islands, and it does on a reasonably regular basis, pretty much the first thing that always happens in the capital, Honiara, is that Chinatown gets burnt down.
Yes.
That's happened on this occasion.
Yes.
So we in Australia have sent in police, a small contingent of police and Defence Force to help the Solomon Islands police to retain order. But I think what's going to happen now is there'll be a playing out at a political level inside Solomon's politics. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see a change of government. And that in turn will reflect on how the Solomons government engages with Beijing.
Yeah, I was watching what was happening in the Solomon Islands on Al Jazeera, and it was only when I dug a little bit deeper that I found that this was much over recognition of Taiwan versus Beijing. And it has its roots from a couple of years ago, but I think it speaks to what's happening in the wider region. And it's something that's not on our radar. It almost sneaks up on you, especially for us in Canada, but I'm sure for Australians, it's of course much closer to home.
Yes.
I did have a question for you on some of the economic issues because of the fallout of the trade issues with China. Australia was, I think, the largest supplier of coal and bauxite to China. And I know they've been having blackouts in the northern parts of China because of a lack of coal. At least that was the case recently. I'm wondering, where is Australian coal and other commodities going now? I know you mentioned this, but are there other markets opening up all of a sudden across the region?
Well, the problem, if I can look at commodities and sort of the order of their priority for us, the biggest export for us is iron ore, and the biggest customer by far is China. And in fact, that has not been affected because China has a strategic dependence on our supply as much as we have a dependence to want to sell it to them. And so there was a period in the course of this year where iron ore was selling for as much as $200 a ton. Typically, it might be $40 or $50 a ton. So, there was high Chinese demand. China is attempting to break that dependency on Australia by building extractive capabilities in Brazil and West Africa. But the fact of the matter is that they are quite some time away from realization and probably never going to be as secure and reliable a supply. But there are also changes in terms of Chinese domestic demand. And if we see, for example, a tanking of housing, the housing construction sector in China, which I think is in prospect, then the requirement for steel and therefore Australian iron ore is going to fall quite dramatically. So I think we have perhaps 5 years or so where we need to work out new markets or indeed different exports, because I think the future of iron ore is constrained. The same thing is obviously true of coal. I'll put the environmental issues to one side. There's certainly no prospect, I think, for a reduction of coal exports, at least for several decades. China's probably shot itself in the foot with decisions to reduce accessing Australian coking coal, which is coal for heating. And as a result of that, there's been heating and power cuts across the eastern seaboard of China last winter, and the winter that they are now going into, I think they're also going to be seeing similar problems. What China has attempted to do is to source its coal domestically, and in fact that's bad news for the world because it's lower quality coal and more polluting. Meanwhile, there is huge quantities of Australian coal sitting in container vessels in Chinese ports or off Chinese ports, waiting for a change of heart, and we're just waiting to see if that happens. In terms of other big exports, liquefied natural gas and gold continue to be very important to the Chinese market, but they are relatively easier to find alternate markets for. And so the big problem for Australia is iron ore, because we will not find a market as substantial as China at any time in the future.
With the fallout of what has happened recently, are there still is there still significant investment by the Chinese in certain segments of the Australian economy? Or have they been disinvesting?
It's substantially dropped off. Again, the high point was around that 2014-15 period, and it played into different areas. So the largest form of investment, and I think this might be true in Canada as well, actually, is in domestic housing. And there was a huge volume of Chinese interest in apartments in the major cities, and freestanding houses as well. And in a sense, this was happening sort of in spite of the party's demands rather than because of the party's demands. It was a case of individual Chinese consumers trying to get money offshore and outside of the control of the Communist Party. And in about 2016, the party brought in a series of measures which actually limited the legal capacity of Chinese citizens to move more than about $50,000 offshore. Then another area that's worth just briefly touching on is critical infrastructure, Chinese investment into ports, airports, the grid, gas, medical areas. That was a very substantial flow of investment in about the middle of the previous decade, which has now largely been cut off by Australia as a result of national security concerns. And our government wouldn't say it quite as bluntly as this, but there is now an acceptance that Chinese investment is different from any other type of investment, Canadian investment, say, because it comes with strings attached, and particularly with critical infrastructure, it comes with the risk of hostile cyber malware being put into the industrial control systems of critical infrastructure. So government has stopped pretty much all of that investment from taking place. The challenge they've got now is, what do you do about the consequences of past decisions? Because pretty much all of the East Coast electricity grid, for example, from Queensland all the way down through to South Australia is under the control of either one Chinese state-owned enterprise or a Hong Kong company or subsidiaries of those companies. And that's a problem which has simply been too big and too ugly for our government to really think about up to this point.
It's very interesting to know. It's actually, that is just quite important how this just happens, and you find that this is a major piece of infrastructure that's owned by a foreign investor that you may be having troubles with. And it kind of ties into a question. I'm actually delighted to have this question from one of my students on the military Joint Command and Staff program. And it's about how the AUKUS arrangement views China more as a military problem, so to speak, whereas Canada seems to have a more balanced approach at the moment, not really willing to commit one way or the other when it comes to China, even though we've had many challenges in the recent past. He asks, should the world see China as an enemy or a foe, or something in between? And do you see like our position in Canada being somewhat naive?
Yes, I think Canada's position is naive. I think you're probably about 3 or 4 years behind where Australia is on this issue. And Partly it's because you have different strategic geography, that's clear. So Canada doesn't necessarily have to think about the military threats posed by China in a way that Australia does. Not necessarily direct threats to the Australian mainland, but certainly within the Indo-Pacific region that would have a profound impact on our own security. But in every other respect, I think Canada and most other of the developed democracies are in exactly the same boat. So, an obvious problem for Canada is your 5G network, which is, I think, a decision. Can I respectfully say that I think Ottawa has sat on for too long in terms of where you're going to go, and it will clearly impact on Canada's relations with the US and the Five Eyes countries. If Canada, for example, decided that somehow, and contrary to the views of every other decent intelligence agency in the world, somehow you're going to be able to mitigate the risk of having Chinese components in your 5G network. But then more broadly, let's look at what continues to be industrial levels of intellectual property theft coming from cyber-enabled spying, a significant level of human intelligence activity in our countries, which I have no doubt is impacting on Canada. The over-dependence of your university sector on Chinese fee-paying students and on research relationships, which again has the problem of siphoning off Canadian IP into the Chinese military industrial system. And then there are sorts of the problems of the commons, as I would describe it: China in space, China in the Arctic, China dealing with other countries that Canada values in terms of its relationships. China undermining multilateral forums like the World Health Organization in ways which don't suit the interests of the democracies. So, my view is that it is possible to have a valuable trade relationship with China at the same time as one seeks to constrain and prevent their interests in wanting to sort of infiltrate and undermine the robustness of your own political processes. But fundamentally, China under Xi Jinping, China under the Communist Party is as much a problem for Canada as it is for Australia, the UK, any of the developed democracies. And I think that's a position that ultimately Canada will have to either accept or potentially choose to go the New Zealand path, which is simply to kind of lay back and learn to love the new imperial order. So there is that strategic choice, but what impact that will then have with Canada's relations, for example, in Washington, D.C., I don't know.
But what do you think about China's behavior itself? Because as I think I've read, and very few friends per se, they're all on their own in many respects. What we are seeing out of with President Xi and the Communist Party and what is happening there. I would imagine that, is this self-sustaining for them because they seem to be being cut off more and more every day?
I think Xi Jinping has made a number of really disastrous policy choices which are working now to undermine China's position internationally. The wolf warrior approach in diplomacy is one. China has clearly lost huge levels of popular trust in many, many countries around the world as a result of, frankly, rude and abrasive and sort of win-lose types of behavior. I think China's management of the pandemic again has not won friends. China's use of sort of economic coercion in countries where China is trying to seek different political outcomes again has not helped China in terms of its perceptions through the region. And I have no doubt, Chris, that there will be really smart people inside the Communist Party quietly thinking to themselves, gee, this isn't working. But no one's going to go knocking on Xi Jinping's door to say, "You got it wrong, boss." I mean, he has now sort of purged his way to a position of absolute sole authority inside the party and the military and the intelligence apparatus. I would say at least for five years. How's that going to end? I suspect badly. These types of regimes find it very hard to affect peaceful political leadership change, and I think that's what Xi Jinping has bequeathed his party. And I think also that structurally there are serious problems inside China of a demographic and economic nature and an environmental nature, which ultimately are going to put immense pressures on the party in ways that really make the international stuff that we've been talking about a second order or third order issue for the party. Their entire focus is about maintaining control inside the country. And the challenges of doing that are just getting harder and harder. So I think China is actually heading into really difficult territory over the coming decade, which is going to put the party under pressure. That's not necessarily good news for us, because that might then lead China to conclude that a diversionary tactic to harness Chinese nationalism over an attempt to take control of Taiwan, for example, might be something that the party would do simply to hang on to power. So a weakening China with deep structural deficiencies is perhaps even more dangerous than a growing China. But either of those scenarios, I think, present serious complications for a country like Australia.
We have seen interesting things with the limitation on video games that the kids can play, and wanting to move out K-pop from the country, and so there are very interesting things going on inside the country. I wanted to ask you about the United States. There was a time here not that long ago when we were really worried about the United States and its role in the world and in terms of leadership. We've now had a change in administration, but I know that many countries still worry about the United States. They worry about the United States being there for them, and if they're not worrying about that, they're worrying about being too over-dependent on the United States. And I'm wondering, in the change between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, did something happen in Australia? Did getting closer with the United States suddenly begin to look as something that should be done or could be done, or was that already in the works beforehand?
It was most definitely in the works. And in fact, I think one of the problems for Australian strategic thinking is that at the moment, just about every problem appears to have a solution which involves getting closer to the United States. That was true with Trump. It was true with Biden. I mean, clearly, we're much more comfortable with Biden. We like the idea of an administration that makes orderly policy decisions, of a president that's capable of reading his daily intelligence brief. I mean, all of these things are just easier to deal with. But in fact, structurally, if you look at Biden, the Biden administration, I don't think much has really changed since the core elements of American policy were kind of designed by Trump. So, for example, a distaste about being involved in the Middle East, at least with ground forces, a series of concerns about China, an expectation that allies should do more and that America is going to be much harder to sort of come to the security rescue of friends and partners. All of these things exist across the really the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations, even though probably all three presidents would be appalled to be told that they were similar to each other. I think as one looks at America's prospects into the future, there's obviously reason for the allies to be concerned about what this means for coherent American policy. By the way, I think to me it looks like Biden, we've probably reached peak Biden in terms of the coherence of Biden policy. Usually the first 2 years are the best and then it gets worse after that. So that doesn't bode terribly well in terms of America's international position. What does it mean for us? Well, I think the Allies have to work hard to make America the best ally it can be. There is no option for Australia other than to sort of double down on the strength of that American relationship, because America's involvement in the Indo-Pacific is the critical factor that stabilizes the region in the interests of most of the regional players. If America was truly to sort of give up on Asia from Hawaii, and only look out from Hawaii, then we're in deep trouble. And I frankly don't know what Australia's options are. None of them would be palatable. So we need to work to make America the best America it can be.
And everything I've learned about Australia has come from watching Netflix programs like Secret City, where we had the Chinese influence, and we don't have anything like that in Canada. I think maybe we are 3 to 4 years behind, and eventually we'll have some dramas focused along the same lines. And this ties into a question that Jonathan Manthorpe actually has for you about our two governments. We seem to be in somewhat of the same situation. Is there any way for our two governments to work together to share information and coordinate our responses, or have we passed that point and Australia's on its own path?
Look, it's a good question. I mean, I've been a fan of the bilateral relationship for many years. When I was inside government in the Defence Department, I did my best to try to build closer defence engagement. I always felt that what we had, and frankly still have, with our defence relationship is really a series of exercises and encounters and engagements and troop secondments and those sorts of things, which have developed over the decades. But there's a hollowness at the centre of it. There's not really a lot of sharing in terms of sharing strategic policy thinking. Yes, we share intelligence, but that doesn't necessarily percolate through to policy outcomes. And when it comes to political relationships, both countries are usually happy to sort of mouth cliches about how close we are and how much we like each other, but don't really want to press each other to do more. You know, the last time there was political level interest in doing more was a brief period where we had Tony Abbott as Australian Prime Minister and Harper as Canadian Prime Minister talking about the importance of the bilateral relationship. And I think, to be candid, a rather sceptical bureaucracy sort of saying, "You're serious about that? You're really interested?" And then I think, you know, Mr. Harper's enthusiasm for the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific perhaps didn't commend that thought to the Trudeau folk when they came in. So, Chris, we like each other, but we're not really prepared to make the extra effort, and I think that has been a disappointment in the relationship. You know, and we sort of end up consoling each other over just how long it takes to get to between Canberra and Ottawa. And I have to concede it does take a very long time. But I think there's let's be positive about it and say there's unrealized potential. I think there's a lot more that we could do. And it really should start with some serious-minded conversations about China and about how we could actively make better use of each other's strengths. You know, I would like to see Canada, for example, build itself into the industrial dispensation, which I think is at the core of AUKUS thinking. And really, Canada's going to have to do that if you look at the structure of your defence industry in particular. So, you know, there's a good agenda of stuff we could talk about if only we were serious enough about it.
Well, thank you for that. And I see we've approaching 5 p.m. It's been a really fast hour, and it's been a delight to explore these issues with you. And it's something that we will pick up with retired Vice Admiral Paul Madison early next year, when we have a sort of part 2 with a little bit of a Canadian flavor to this very important discussion, because I think we are finally seeing some movement on the part of Canada, just simply by the mention of Indo-Pacific in the throne speech, a signal, let's say, that things are afoot and we may see something happening from the Canadian side. I'd like to thank you, Peter. I'd ask you if you have any final comments. I think what you just said about the relationship with Canada was so important. Before we do close out the evening here, at least, is there anything you would like to just say to our
So, Chris,
audience?
I'd hope everyone on the call, seeing as it is evening time in Canada now, goes and opens a bottle of Australian wine.
Yes.
There is nothing that Canadians could do that would help us more at this time of maximum pressure from our friends in China than to buy what is extremely high quality and very reasonably priced Australian wine coming your way. So that would be my
Yes.
concluding remarks.
And that is a great way, and I encourage everybody to do the same. So, Peter, on behalf of us here, I'd like to thank you so much for spending your time with us. It's been incredibly important for us to have this conversation. I'd like to thank our audience also for taking the time to be with us, and stay tuned for more CIC Victoria events. We do tend to focus a lot on what is happening in the Indo-Pacific these days. So stick with us. So, Peter, I think it's the morning for you, lunchtime. So
yes, that's right.
Have a
No
great
wine for me.
No wine for you. Thank you again. Thank you, everybody, and
Thanks.
we'll see you at some point in
a great conversation, Chris. Thanks so much.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.